Hi, everyone. For the people that haven't met me yet, I'm Logan Barrett. I'm a master's student. We're here with Abby Aresty, who is on the faculty at the Oberlin Conservatory at the Tomorrow program. She did her undergraduate degree at Eastman, I believe, and you did your graduate studies at University of Washington. And we have a few questions we're going to ask. I'm here with Zihan Wu and Zach Berenbaum, if you two want to introduce yourselves real quick.
Yeah, hi, I'm Zihan. I'm a sophomore composition major student at Eastman School of Music.
Hi, I'm Zach Berenbaum. I am a first-year composition student at Eastman School of Music.
Pleasure to meet you all. Sorry, go ahead.
I think we're going to start with Zihan to ask you a few questions.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for all of your fantastic work. And we found that you are especially interested in composing electronic music or electroacoustic music. So could you maybe share your experience of how you usually start composing a piece? For example, like in your piece Moments, which all of us are really enjoyed, and we find that it has a wonderful structure. So could you tell us about how do you come up with the electronic part? Did you draw the sketch of the framework initially about the sound that you want and then looking for them in many ways, or did you record some materials that you like first and then weave them together as a complete piece?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Jan. That's a great question. Yeah, I guess I often start by recording sound. Most of my music is really inspired by listening to the world around me, listening to found sounds, found objects. So when I first sort of was introduced to that world by Alan Schindler back when I was a student, I was really, really excited by just being able to actually work directly with the sounds themselves. So it varies from piece to piece, but for Moments, I started with field recording actually in Joshua Tree National Park. Was unexpectedly surrounded by mosquitoes. So that's what most of my field recordings were of, and kind of had to deal with that in the moment. And subsequently was also working with some found sounds, squeezing balloons, all sorts of different sounds, just kind of playing really. It actually started as two separate pieces. So the field recordings were going to be sort of one inspiration for one piece, and then the other found sounds were really planned for another piece. But often I've found that even the best laid plans, you discover that actually the material can work quite well together. So it's a process after collecting the sounds, really trying to work with gestures and expanding those sounds, the palette of each of the particular sounds, and building them on top of each other. Sometimes I will sketch out an actual structure for the piece in advance, but I like to be guided by the sounds. So I find increasingly, maybe I have a sort of general idea in my head, but I'm open to different directions as I find new sounds and bring them together.
Oh, that's really cool. And I was wondering if the process is different when you write electroacoustic music, like in your flute piece, because which part comes first, the instrument part or the electronic part, or they just come up simultaneously based on the overall design?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much. Again, varies by piece. In the flute piece I shared with you all, it's sort of a funny story. I recorded the sounds from the flutist, who is Daria Benkowski, who's also a former Eastman student. But that was actually when I was in Michigan for my master's program. And so I recorded all the sounds and was sort of waiting to hear back about a grant, whether we were going to get the grant to be able to bring Daria back to do some more work together on the piece. So I created pretty much the entire electroacoustic part before I wrote any of the flute part, which is not how I necessarily would have planned, but I didn't know whether Daria was going to be able to play that piece sort of live. We were waiting on funding. So after having composed what I thought was a complete electroacoustic piece, I then had to fit a flute part into it because we got the grant. And again, was really inspired by the incredible work that she had done. I mean, she is, very good at extended techniques, as you can sort of tell from the recordings. And so took the electroacoustic part of the project as my inspiration and fit the flute part in around it. And for sure, there was definitely, after we had sort of added the flute part and knew that that was going to be part of the piece, I'm sure at that point I also extended the electronic part, but it was a piece in and of itself before the flute, live flute was added.
Oh, I see. It's really interesting. So you kind of build up the piece like over times. So I think it's really interesting. So, and some of us are wondering that if the if working with electronics changed your perception or approach to your musical ideas, like he finds that some of your works, a pursuit for kind of meta-instrumentalism is often implicit, but looks like it isn't your ultimate goal. So is there any specific thing that you're hoping to follow or delve into through the huge possibilities of electronic sound?
Cool. Yeah, thanks. I'll try to speak to that. So definitely the experience of working with electroacoustic sound influenced my composition more generally, particularly in being able to explore timbre and gesture in different sort of ways. I think the inherent gestures of found sounds are very interesting to explore, both in electroacoustic music and also in more sort of instrumental music. I really, in recent years, don't write a lot of acoustic music anymore. So I would say, in a sense, I often think of it in the reverse. I think about the ways in which my acoustic training influences my electroacoustic and sound art practices. So thinking about counterpoint and thinking about that in sort of the broadest terms is really important to me in the types of projects that I work on. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Let me know.
Yeah. So basically, you study the acoustic music and then turn your experience like into the electronic music, and then just explore more of it. Is it right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So since not all of us at Eastman now are really truly explore ourselves to electronic music, so maybe do you have any tips for beginners, like people just want to learn the electronic music but haven't started yet?
Sure, yeah. There's so many different paths into electroacoustic music. I think it's very valuable to start with recording. So recording sounds out in the world, field recording, and then also experimenting with recording found sounds at home, just around the house, working with contact microphones, these sorts of things. If you haven't come across Nick Collins' Handmade Electronica Music, it's a really useful book that can kind of get you started on the path of DIY practice. It's something that is really important to my practice now. So that's really where I would start if I had to suggest. And from there, I mean, there's so many different paths you could take with digital audio workstations, or more with sort of all sorts of different programming languages, from super collider C sound to more max MSP, that sort of thing. I think it depends. It's a great question. It's broad. So,
so when did you start to compose electronic music? Maybe.
Yeah.
At Eastman.
Yep, at Eastman. So definitely. So I started, I guess it was my sophomore year. I took Alan Schindler's Introduction to Electronic Music class. And I also participated in the Image Movement Sound Festival. So I collaborated with artists and visual artists and dancers. And it was, really a huge inspiration. I think my first piece ever was for harp. Basically, it recorded a friend who played the harp and just used harp sounds for the project, and was really inspired by the ability to transform those sounds into a piece. And I included that piece as one of many threads that is in the piece Patchwork that I shared with you all. It's just that short 1-minute tribute to Alan Schindler.
Really interesting. And thank you for sharing your experience and the ideas of a combination of sound of electronic music. And I think Zach are going to asking another series of questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan.
Thanks for turning it over. Let me look here. Okay, so something that you mentioned a couple minutes ago, and also I saw that you have I saw that you're a YouTube channel that has a bunch of like tutorials for like certain softwares like Max MSP or Reaper, and I think Audacity was on there too. So I was kind of wondering how, since there's so many different kind of like software options available and like DAWs and all of these different, I guess, tools that we have at our disposal to start doing electronic composition, how do you like navigate like which one would be good for a certain piece and which one wouldn't be good for a certain piece, and how do you choose, and do you choose, or does it just kind of happen?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. It varies by piece. So often I would say I don't use a single tool for a piece. Often I use many tools for a piece. So a project that I didn't share with you all is an ongoing installation called Of Earth and Sun. It's for the Center for Sustainable Landscapes in Pittsburgh, which is part of a conservatory botanical gardens. And so, for example, for that piece, I did a lot of field recording. I used RX7. It's an isotope product, which is like basically lets you just really in detail get into like the spectral analysis and sort of taking away different parts of the sounds in order to clean up and use what you want. And then I also used Max MSP, or am using Max MSP for the programming. So it's a generative piece, so it's particularly useful in that way. For a lot of my electroacoustic music, excuse me, interesting. For a lot of my electroacoustic music, I like to hop around between different programs. Back when I was at the University of Washington, I used Super Collider a lot more and would use that for editing sounds, and sometimes, or sort of playing with some of the sounds, creating different gestures sort of more generatively and incorporating those into pieces. But more recently, I find that I like to hop between Reaper, digital audio workstation, as well as Ableton, Live 10. And I use them for different purposes. I have used Ableton for some live stuff, like Inkling. I used Ableton for, but I also use it just as a tool for playing with some of the sounds and creating different gestures that I then sort of stitch together in Reaper. So yeah, it varies.
So it's really more being familiar with what each software is good at, and just kind of using it to that ability.
Yeah, that's a great
All right.
Put it.
So with regards to the site-specific sound installations, I was kind of wondering, and a lot of the questions were about this. Kind of how did you begin doing that? I know that you mentioned earlier you started with electroacoustic composition with recording and other stuff. Was it kind of in that vein, or was there a different kind of a different way that you started site-specific sound installations?
Sure, yeah. So my first project in that vein was Paths 2, the music of trees, which I shared with you all. And that was a project that started with an idea of just having a piece spatialized in a single tree, and creating a listening experience that way. And I was fortunate to be put in touch with the director of the Arboretum at that time in Seattle, in Washington's Park Arboretum. And, really the first part of that process was spending a lot of time in that space and a lot of time in conversation with the director of the Arboretum and other stakeholders to get a sense for the space and how I, as a student artist, at that time could contribute to the space in a positive way, and sort of meet their needs and not interrupt other stakeholders who are using the space, right? So anytime you're working in a public space, it becomes really important to think not just about your own vision, but also about how other people are really interacting with and using that space. So after those initial conversations and spending really a lot of time just going to the space, walking through the space, listening to the space, then it was a matter of field recording in the space over the course of a year, and at the same time simultaneously working on the technology piece, because an early draft of that project had different technology at every site, and it was more interactive. And subsequently I realized that I needed to be able to fabricate a lot of technology in order to be installed in the site, and needed to be able to last outside, with no, in the elements, with power issues, those sorts of things, all at play, safety, and it needed to be able to be installed by the arborist. So, because I wasn't allowed to climb the trees in the Arboretum, and I wouldn't have been able to myself anyway. So it needed to be designed in a way that was feasible for that collaboration to take place. So, so simultaneously recording and building the technology for the piece, had help from folks at the University of Washington, which is, just to be able to bounce ideas off of, get different directions, spend a lot of time tracking down really specific, I spent a lot of time looking at Burning Man and different places where people are trying to power things outside, and did a lot of research that way, was able to find solutions, and brought the installation to the space. And at that point it was a matter of composing. I think most of the composing in Super Collider, the technology itself was actually very lo-fi. There were car stereos attached to marine batteries and solar panels, and was put up with weatherproofing up in the site, and had to turn on and off at particular times. So there's this company that makes these timers for feeding pets. So those were there. So it was in many ways a really sort of hacked together thing, but it was quite effective because the technology was hidden, so you weren't able to actually see that particularly well unless you really looked around. That was sort of the genesis of that piece.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it sounds like it was quite a project to put together. So when you were making Paths 2, did you consider? I know that you had to consider, how other people would be in the space, but when you were thinking about sound specifically, did you think about how the sounds that you recorded in that space and then brought reintroduced back into the space would mix with the sounds that were native to the space at the time that the installation was going? Did you purposefully like know that these sounds would mix in this a certain way, or was it more aleatoric and that you just kind of let whatever happened come out of it?
Well, both really. That's a great question. I would say both really. You know, you can never, no matter how much time you spend in a space, and I spent quite a lot of time in that space, you can never know exactly what's going to happen, what sounds are going to come into a particular site. You can have a sense for what the soundscape is in general over time, but you can't know for sure what's going to happen when, or any of those sorts of things. So for sure, there's a lot of chance to that experience, and I thought that kept the piece alive. And you know, each time I went back, it was a little bit different. The cycles of the pieces were also timed so specifically so that they never, well, you know, it was a cycle, so they would, you know, cycle in and out of a phase, if you will, over time. But the piece was really about bridging, creating this sort of interjection to create a bridge between human-made and natural sounds in the Arboretum, which I felt like were often sort of in dialogue with each other, but also sort of in some sort of tension with each other. It's you know, it's an Arboretum, it's a natural space in a city environment, an urban environment. There's a lot of noise pollution, and there's also a lot of natural sound. And I think it was really interesting in having conversations with folks at the Arboretum when I spoke specifically to wanting to create that dialogue and listen to the noise. A lot of people were like, "Oh, no, we don't want to think about the noise," right? Like, who wants to come to the Arboretum to listen to the noise? But for me, in that piece, it was really about creating that dialogue. So I think it was a really challenging sell in some ways, but the people that I was able to lead through sound walks through the project, I think appreciated and seem to get that and take it away.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting way to think about it. The dialogue between the two kind of groups of sounds. So when you're creating a piece of electroacoustic music, or it would also apply to Paths 2 and other site-specific pieces. Do you ever find it difficult to organize your material, or find I know that we just talked about this with Paths 2, but finding a balance between an acoustic side and the electronic side? Do you ever find that difficult, or is it just kind of more natural to you at this point? It just kind of comes together.
Well, I mean, I think Paths 2 is an interesting example, maybe speaking not exactly to the structure, but to the balance in creating that piece. My tendency, my approach initially as I was writing was to fill up all the space, right? Because I was used to, at that point, composing for the concert hall. And so I thought there should be stuff happening, basically. Like I should be, you know, creating sound. I should be, you know, taking up all of the space. And, you know, quickly realized that that was not the right approach for that piece, right? So I needed to spend a lot of time taking things out of the project after I had written them and being like, oh, no, you need to edit it out. And so I'd say that, you know, it's always a process of listening. And I think it can be challenging, particularly the closer you get to a project, the harder it is to be sort of objective about it. So sometimes, you know, step away and come back to it and listen with fresh ears. And I think that's very helpful. So I'd say, yes, probably more intuitive than anything else at this point. But yeah.
So after you've kind of gotten like a rough draft of a piece, and you kind of come back to it with a more analytical ear, and it's sort of like whatever feels like it needs to be done, more than like there's a theoretical, like I know that I need to do this for this reason. Yeah,
I would say yes, it's very much at this point more intuitive. I'm thinking of Moments, for example, which is a piece that started out, it was probably 10, 11 minutes at least when I first wrote it. And then I listened to it literally right before the concert and with other people in the hall, and it suddenly felt way too long to me. So the day before the concert, I made some massive cuts to the piece and thought it was much more effective in that moment. I think time is very different when you're listening to something by yourself versus when you're listening to it with others, and you suddenly realize, wow, I was pretty long-winded there and I really didn't need to be. And so I think it's a better piece for it.
Yeah, all right. I think I have one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Logan. For your work Inkling, are there specific objects that you prefer to be used, or that are more effective when creating the like with regards to creating the score and the piece as a whole?
Thanks. Yeah. So I have no specific requirements about what objects are used. I found having a variety of different textures, materials is really useful. You know, we've used these sort of seed pods, maybe, or gumballs, whatever, the spiky found objects. We've used balloons, we've used utensils. I mean, it's as long as there's a variety, I think it's really up to the performer. Yeah, like variety of both the shape, the size, the material. I think that is really what's most important for that piece. All
right, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I think I'll piggyback off of a few things that we were just talking about to start. I think with the Inkling piece, as well as like your piece Touch, which hasn't been recorded yet, but you sent us, I think something intriguing about those pieces is that the piece might not necessarily lie in like the resultant sound or in like the decisions that you made in a way that pieces that we're used to might. Like your scores you said were only like one page and you gave like instructions for how the piece would happen, but what actually happens is either up to the performer, up to, you know, what happens. So where do you think the creative process for work like that lies?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that really excites me about writing pieces that are more open-ended in that sense is that sometimes I feel like there's this sort of false dichotomy of like performer, composer, and that you know, the composer is basically creating a piece that is then only realized by a performer, and that the performer isn't really part of the creative process in some ways. And maybe this is something that I've internalized over the years that I don't feel like is necessarily true. You know, even going back to my piece Piercing the Veil of Kindness, that piece never would have been written without you know, Daria and her incredible improvisatory skills or incredible extended techniques. So in these sorts of more open-ended pieces, I think it's making that element of the creative process far more visible and celebrating it in a way. You know, so far I'm the only one who's performed Touch, and Inkling has been performed a couple of times with myself on the electronics and different, first a visual artist drawing, and then second a percussionist. And it was fascinating to me to see the difference of approach of the visual artist, who's, you know, particularly was teaching drawing, and that's how we came to collaborate on that piece, versus the percussionist. And I, you know, I loved, as you might expect, like particularly loved the visual end results of the drawings created by the visual artist. And on the other hand, sort of slightly preferred in some ways the interpretation by the percussionist, who was thinking perhaps more musically, more in terms of phrases as they were creating that iteration of the piece. And but what I love about it is who am I to say, right? I've like given up that that aspect of the piece to the performer, and I think that is something that really inspires me to create projects that provide opportunities for others to you know, engage with sound creatively, and so that's really at the heart of that piece, I'd say.
Yeah, and I think something related to that is sort of like how you get inspired or how you can evaluate yourself with that type of work. We sort of touched on it a few times. So, you know, a lot of us get into music because we've heard music before and it's something we're familiar with. When we're composing, we can look at other people's music to sort of evaluate our own. We sort of have a common thread and we know what we're doing. But in these pieces, it's sort of like, the reasons we get into it might not be because we've experienced or heard work in that area. It might be more from working with software or just like doing some hands-on project. So when trying to think about how you're gonna maybe start one of these pieces or how you're gonna conceive of it, like where do you go to get inspiration and where do you go to like find other creative ideas?
Yeah. That's a great question. I would say, so usually, first of all, the spark of inspiration is that there's a concert that, you know, I need to put something on, right? And so there's nothing like a deadline to spark inspiration in that sense. And then after having, you know, that element, like, okay, I have this tangible deadline, something that I know that I'm going to be working towards. It's not that I so much go out looking for inspiration, more so that I've been, whether through teaching or just through my own research, engaging with lots of different artists and different ideas that then are all sort of, you know, floating around in my head and coming together in different ways, sometimes over quite a long period of time. So for Inkling, for example, there's an artist, I think formerly Canadian, perhaps US based now, but Lauren Chase, who has a project called Odic Diaries. And I had a class years ago do one of his exercises, which was taking found objects and rubbing them across different surfaces and creating an exhibit from those rubbings that basically illustrates, you know, a moment in time, a sound in a particular moment. And that project just really stayed with me for a very long time. And between that and then thinking about graphic scores, more just very broadly defined, and being really inspired again by this idea of creating space for really anyone to engage creatively with sound, and being, you know, obsessed again with contact microphones and Nikon's handmade electronic music. You know, at a certain point, that was, you know, those different pieces, the different threads came together into that piece, into that project. And so, and with the touch, with the symbols and everything, I spent a lot of time with David Tudor, who's Rainforest 4, had a class create that. And so, you know, obsessed with those sorts of, you know, found objects as speakers and things like that. And yeah, so it's many different influences kind of coming together over time.
Yeah. So, well, it's sounding like to me that you might get inspiration from other artists and other art forms. In relation to maybe the students at Eastman, we have to spend a lot of time like working in the musical field, like we're around many musicians all of the time. So what can we be doing to sort of, one, foster those collaborative opportunities with other people, and two, be able to like explain what we do and offer it to other people in order to make meaningful collaborations?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I mean, thinking back to my time, so at Eastman in particular, in addition to the Image Movement Sound Festival and working in that, I spent actually not an insignificant time at the University of Rochester taking some of my classes there. It's a really interesting space, I think, to get to meet other people who are looking or who are working in different disciplines, who are thinking about things in different ways, and being able and willing to collaborate on those sorts of projects, like projects that might grow out of another class. I do a lot of these days cold emailing of, following up with people. I mean, not so much cold emailing anymore now that because it's a very small community, but shortly after I got here, I was able to settle in. It was a lot of just sort of reaching out, having conversations with people, and playing that sort of networking game that, you hear about, where you just kind of share what you're interested in and are able to then begin to get to know people and move on from there. In terms of speaking to artists about the type of work that you're doing, who are maybe not in the discipline, the more time you spend with other disciplines, the more you realize that there's a lot of really interesting overlaps, right? And there's a lot of different ways in which, a film or a piece of, visual art, ties back, and there's a name for that they have, and that ties back to things that you might be learning in music. So I'm always referring back, as I said previously, to my acoustic training and thinking about the ideas of texture and timbre and gesture and counterpoint, and using them in kind of abstract ways. And I think just, being able to recognize something and speak to and find excitement and interest in something that someone's showing you, that's, I think, sort of where those connections might lie. I don't know, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. I think sort of in the same vein, you were talking about the Arboretum piece and how it was very technology based. I mean, similarly, we have resources here at Eastman. We have contact mics and transducers and things to work with. But even with the electronic classes we take here, we might not have the opportunity to do physical projects as part of school in a way that they would at Oberlin maybe. So what can students be learning? Should we be reading books, watching YouTube videos, finding people in the engineering department that would know how to do stuff? What can we be doing to get projects like that off of the ground?
Sure, yeah. Well, yeah. I think that, first of all, we're all really fortunate now to be in a time when these sorts of resources are, there's all sorts of tutorials, that sort of thing online that you can use as a starting point. I would say, don't be shy in terms of reaching out to people. So if you find a tutorial, you could reach out to the person who wrote it, right? And ask for help. The worst thing that happens is that they say no, or they don't respond, right? There's, definitely, it can be hard to make connections across departments. I recently came across a really interesting project that requires me to, have access to the chemistry department and their resources. And I think it's a matter of finding the right people and not just asking immediately for help, but basically making connections and being open to collaborating in other sorts of ways and offering your services, whatever you can do to help to be able to sort of create that reciprocal relationship. So yes, definitely to tutorials. Also, finding advocates for your projects, right? I mean, if I had not come across Sarah Reichard in the University of Washington Arboretum, that project, of course, never would have happened, right? So, and the fact that she was, really open to and excited about supporting that, particularly since I was a student who had never at that time, put solar panels in trees, right? Finding someone who's willing to take a chance on a particular type of project, I think, is very, very valuable.
Yeah, and then, yeah, I think maybe even beyond that, I forget, it was somewhere in the box link that you sent, but you were compiling a list of like resources for making textile-based like electronic projects. So of course, like there's this whole economic component to technology as well, and like you only have a certain amount of money to like afford things and get them. So especially if some composers graduate and don't end up in academia and might not have access to like university resources, what are some creative solutions that people might be able to do to pursue projects outside of school?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, the costs definitely add up to projects, and I'm find that I spend probably as much of my time grant writing, even though they're often internal grants, as anything else, right? So I would say, for starters, definitely I encourage everyone to not take for granted the value of writing skills and being able to articulate to other people outside the field what the value of your project is, and to be able to, for example, even speak not only to your own project, but perhaps how you might be able to use the sort of framework of that project in education or other contexts, so that you can make the case for actually being able to have the funds to move forward with a particular idea in a way that both serves your own concept as well as potentially other members of the community. So I'd say that's one, my little plug for grant writing. In terms of other creative ways, I mean, of course, being able to, one of the things that I think is really lovely about working in sound is that, oftentimes trash makes really interesting sounds, right? So of course, being able to and interested and willing to explore those sorts of issues and materials, I think, is really valuable. Honestly, one of the things that that really stresses me out about e-textiles, as something that I'm coming to very recently, is the environmental impacts of this sort of consumerism. And so even as, I've been able to get the resources to buy materials, I'm not happy with the fact that I'm buying all of these materials, and I have in the back of my mind, what's next? Like, what are the next possibilities? And, been looking into bioplastics and things that you can sort of grow in your kitchen, right? To actually experiment with. And I think, that sort of DIY mentality is necessary, both economically and environmentally, to be able to think about, like, okay, what can I create from scratch? So that's, I haven't quite gotten there yet, but that's where I'm headed next, in terms of, like, okay, how can I really think from scratch? And it's also something that, has come up, lastly, I would just say, in thinking about, for example, a lot of the outreach work that I do is in education, trying to bring these types of projects to different students. And in this new Zoom life, it's hard to actually be able to get these resources to students. So we're instead thinking about, like, okay, the materials that I shared were from a STEAM toolkit that was part of a presentation, a workshop that we did at the New Interfaces for Musical Expressions conference over the summer. And part of what we were trying to do in that workshop is to brainstorm together, okay, how do we create a remote NIME workshop for kids that that's actually doable, because it doesn't require access to all sorts of expensive equipment. I don't know that we solved that problem, but it's on our map.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that was sort of my, touching on my next question. There's always sort of the obligatory COVID question that we have to ask now about how that's impacting your work. So I mean, in your own composing, like, has what projects you wanted to work on changed? Like, have you shifted priorities? did any of your projects get interrupted? Yeah, how are things going to be different moving forward?
Yeah. Well, I would say the projects that were most significantly interrupted were more so outreach projects, which I still sort of classify as my own creative work, even though it's very much collaborative and maybe not maybe not familiar in some ways to that end. But so, for example, in the spring, I was teaching a class called Sonic Arts and Society, and it's a community-based learning class. And our partner was it was a local hospital, University Hospital Areas Medical Center, and which it is what it is, I guess. So we, in March, obviously sent our students home. The hospital obviously was not accepting any more outreach initiatives. And so, we had just started a section on breathing, and I've been very inspired in breath and music for many years. And so this was supposed to be in collaboration with a respiratory therapist with their Better Breathers Club, which is folks who have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. We had met with her a couple of times to try to create some sort of custom wind instruments, sort of DIY, newly imagined wind instruments that we were going to bring for a workshop. That was, of course, completely disruptive, and we decided that had to entirely stop that collaboration because we didn't want to impose upon our community partner. So that became much more of a student-based breathing meditations class, and we were really inspired by Pauline Oliver's Sonic Meditations, that sort of thing, for that segment of the class. We were also working at the time on an installation, a sound installation called Gratitude Showers Challenge, and bringing together messages of gratitude and using these custom cut, circuits, metronome circuits, to create sort of a rain shower effect. And of course, we couldn't continue that, and it became a virtual project, at least for the time. We're actually now trying to build the installation, figuring out when we'll be able to install it, but it became very much more so about the creation of like a video explaining the project and a website and all of these things that I think in the end made the project more effective as an outreach tool, because it told the story of the project, and we were able to involve a lot more. We changed the community a little bit, so we were gathering messages from kids instead of from the general hospital community, and I think in the end it became a stronger outreach project in that way. So those are the things that sort of come to mind more specifically, because all my other sort of creative work I can sort of do wherever, whenever, and it was not as much impacted directly by COVID.
Yeah, so I think the question for, I guess, the future in general, I don't know if this is just a personal question. I don't know if, something I've been thinking about is that I know in the music field, things they often can feel sort of, I don't know, selfish, or like relating to our, like we're like very insular, staying within our own community, like writing pieces to get played by musicians. They can only get performed in a certain number of places and for certain contexts. And the thing that's really exciting to me about technology and technology-based projects is that you can sort of use what you know and give it back to other people. Like, you don't have to explain to them what you're doing musically. You can just sort of do something much more hands-on that other people can understand right away. So what have your thoughts like just been on that in general, and like how did your extensive music training inform that and what you've been doing?
Yeah, I totally agree. And in terms of having very similar thoughts and feelings, particularly in the run-up to, for example, the Paths 2 piece. I was very, at that time in particular, tired of the concert hall and these sort of really small like always composing for the same venues, for the same people, and feeling like I just didn't necessarily have, I wasn't able to really have an impact or experience sort of outside of that community. And so I would say the experience of working in a site-specific piece, thinking about acoustic ecology, thinking about listening more broadly, and actually taking many people on sound walks through the installation, though people could kind of experience it on their own time. Wow, was that just good for my heart to be able to speak to them about their own listening, right? And to be able to have them sort of excitedly talk about things that they were remembering, you know, people coming who said, you know, gosh, my mom who just passed away, her favorite place was the Arboretum, and I've come back and, you know, again and again to hear this, to be able to spend more time in the Arboretum, and just to sort of interrupt, in a sense, and hopefully mostly a good sense, interrupt the sort of daily way in which we interact with natural spaces. So often it's just like we go out for a run, right? Or we go, you know, or we just go for a walk to chat with friends, which are all really beautiful and valuable things, but isn't it nice to have something that just sort of draws attention in a different kind of way to a particular location? So for me, that moment in time was very much about that phenomenon you're describing, and finding a purpose and a meaning in being able to work for, to create a project that was really for a community. And in turn, subsequently, I was just very inspired at that moment to start thinking about the listeners, like the audience, right? And so a lot of the pieces, more recent pieces that I sent that are about these sort of storytelling opportunities are directly inspired from that experience of listening to other people's stories. So the project, the What I Didn't Say project, the Artifact project, all these projects that are these sort of like small scale stories and making projects are directly have grown out of this just joy that I felt in being able to learn from other people's experiences through that project.
Cool. So I think we'll wrap it up there, unless the other two have another question they want to add in. I have to go right at noon, but if we have any last minute questions. I think we're good.
I think we're good. I think the whole thing.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. It was really great to hear about your work.
Thank you all for your great questions. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.